thought he'd vanished. Living quietly in Spain, drifting between safe houses, changing phones, convinced he was out of reach. But when police forced their way into a Barcelona apartment, the man inside wasn't a tourist or an expat. It was Jamie Rothwell. For years, his name had been whispered in Salford, linked to drugs, guns, and one of the most violent gangland feuds Manchester has ever seen. He wasn't caught with cocaine in his hands or a gun under his bed. He didn't need to be. Detectives had built the picture, encrypted messages, surveillance, the supply lines that connected him to millions of pounds worth of Class A drugs. When Rothwell finally stood in the dock at Manchester Crown Court, the mask slipped. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply cocaine and to firearms offences. The charges told their own story. A man who wasn't just part of Manchester's gang wars, he was helping to fuel them. This is the story of Jamie Rothwell, his rise through Salford's underworld, the years of violence that followed, and the manhunt that finally dragged him back to face justice. Salford has always lived in the shadow of Manchester, a city built on hard labor and tight-knit estates, but one that has long been associated with organized crime. For decades, families here have grown up surrounded by the reputation of gangs that rule their postcodes with fear. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Manchester's headlines were dominated by names like the Gooch Gang and the Doddington Crew. Armed groups who turned Moss Side into a war zone. But in Salford, another crew was rising. They called themselves the A-Team. To locals, they were as feared as the Gooch. To police, they were professional, organized, and ruthless. And at the center of their world was Paul Massey, Salford's Mr. Big, a man who presented himself as a community mediator, but who, in reality, controlled protection rackets, drug shipments, and the kind of violence that kept rivals silent. It was into this world that Jamie Rothwell's name began to surface. By the mid-2000s teens, police intelligence repeatedly placed him alongside known A-Team figures. He wasn't a kid on the corners, he was an operator plugged into the supply chain that brought cocaine into the Northwest. The A-Team thrived on reputation, and Rothwell carried his weight. His name became associated not just with drugs, but with the violence that came with holding territory. Police files link him to the bitter feud that exploded after Massey's death. In July 2015, Paul Massey was assassinated outside his home in Clifton. A gunman sprayed 18 bullets from an Uzi submachine gun, cutting down the man many saw as untouchable. It was the most shocking gangland murder Salford had ever seen, and it left a power vacuum at the heart of the A-Team. What followed was open warfare. Rivals led by Michael Carroll and Stephen Britton pushed against the A-Team's old guard. Petrol bombs were thrown at houses, cars were torched, shots were fired into living rooms while families cowered on the floor. In one attack, a grenade was hurled at the home of an associate, a level of violence more often seen in cartel wars than British cities. Jamie Rothwell was in the middle of it. His home was firebombed, his family were targeted. He wasn't just another name in the feud, he was one of its key players. Detectives believed Rothwell was helping to bankroll the A-Team's survival, funneling cocaine and cannabis into Salford while rivals tried to wipe them out. The feud wasn't just about money, it was about pride, territory, and revenge. Police later said it was like a civil war, fought across terraced streets where children played football while gunmen plotted drive-bys. Rothwell survived. Many didn't. Paul Massey was dead. Other figures were jailed. And through it all, Rothwell's importance only grew. He had the contacts, he had the supply lines, he had the reputation. But in Salford, the longer you stood in the spotlight, the bigger the target on your back became. And as the violence escalated, Greater Manchester Police made Rothwell a priority. They weren't just looking at the shootings, they were following the money, the drugs, the weapons, and slowly the threads began to tie back to him. By the end of the decade, Jamie Rothwell was no longer just a Salford name. He was being watched as part of a wider network, a man who had risen through one of Britain's bloodiest gang wars to become a key link between Manchester's streets and international suppliers. And the police were waiting. After the murder of Paul Massey, Salford's streets were left in chaos. Rivals wanted control, but chaos doesn't last forever. Someone always steps up to rebuild. For police, it soon became clear that Jamie Rothwell wasn't just surviving the feud, he was using it to expand. Rothwell understood something many in the A-Team never did. Violence might win you reputation, but money comes from structure. Behind the headlines of shootings and petrol bombs, he was building the machinery that kept drugs flowing into Greater Manchester. Cocaine from Spain and the Netherlands, cannabis farms spread across the northwest. Heroin shipped in bulk and broken down for street dealers. He wasn't moving it himself. That wasn't his job anymore. Rothwell was a middleman, but one with reach. He handled supply at scale, tens of kilos at a time, feeding gangs who then distributed at street level. His role was invisible to most people in Salford. He wasn't standing on corners, he was coordinating. It worked like a logistics company. Couriers drove across borders, safe houses held the product until it was ready to move. Cash was laundered through businesses and frontmen. And when disputes came up, Rothwell's reputation, forged in years of feuds, was enough to settle them. But there was something else. A tool that changed everything for organized crime in Britain, EncroChat. EncroChat was marketed as the criminal's phone of choice. Modified handsets, encrypted messages, the promise of total security. For years, Rothwell and countless others relied on it. They believed it was untouchable, that police could never read what they were planning. But in 2020, investigators across Europe cracked it. Suddenly, thousands of supposedly secure messages were being pulled from servers in France and handed to detectives in the UK. Overnight, the biggest drug traffickers in Britain were exposed, and Rothwell was right there in the middle. The decrypted files painted a picture of a man at the center of supply lines stretching across borders. His EncroChat handle became a key piece of evidence, linking him to orders for kilos of cocaine, firearms deals, and discussions about Salford's violent feud. He wasn't boasting. He was conducting business, cold, methodical, and always about scale. The messages showed the kind of detail police could only dream of before. Rothwell arranging bulk shipments, negotiating prices, setting up meetings with trusted couriers, talking about straps, firearms, as if they were just another commodity. It wasn't street talk, it was business talk, organized crime written out in real time. For detectives, it was a gold mine. They could now link Rothwell directly to the supply chain that had fueled the gang wars. Not just rumors, not just intelligence, evidence, but there was a problem. By the time EncroChat was cracked and the messages recovered, Jamie Rothwell had already disappeared. He wasn't in Salford anymore, he wasn't even in Britain. The network he had built was under pressure, his associates were being rounded up, and police were preparing to move in. Rothwell knew what was coming, and before they could put cuffs on him, he was gone. It was the start of a manhunt that would stretch across Europe. EncroChat was supposed to be unbreakable. That was the sales pitch. No location tracking, no stored data, messages that vanished at the push of a button. For years, it gave criminals confidence. Rothwell was one of thousands who relied on it, convinced the system would protect him. But when French investigators quietly infiltrated EncroChat's servers in 2020, that illusion collapsed. Thousands of handsets across Europe lit up with compromised data. Police forces suddenly had access to everything, the language of organized crime typed out in cold digital detail. The logs revealed Rothwell in ways traditional surveillance never could. He wasn't just a name in intelligence briefings anymore. He was an active player, arranging wholesale cocaine deals, discussing the importation of firearms, and laying out logistics that showed his reach stretched far beyond Salford. For Greater Manchester Police, it was confirmation. Rothwell wasn't just a Salford foot soldier in the feud, he was fueling it. Drugs and weapons, the lifeblood of the war, were being channeled through his network. And for the first time, they had the receipts. But there was a problem. The leak of EncroChat intelligence couldn't be acted on immediately. The operation was global, coordinated between multiple countries, and secrecy was vital. If suspects realized the system had been cracked, they'd scatter, and scatter is exactly what Rothwell did. In May 2020, as the pressure mounted, Rothwell slipped out of the UK. No fanfare, no public sighting. One day he was in Salford, the next he was gone. For his enemies on the street, it looked like he'd disappeared into thin air. For police, it was confirmation he knew they were closing in. He didn't run to the Costa del Sol villas that so many British fugitives choose. He kept it quieter, moving between Spain and the Netherlands, staying in low-rent flats, keeping his head down. He used false names, different phones, and lived like a man who knew time was running out. Back home, the violence continued. The feud between the A-Team and its rivals claimed more lives. Cars were torched. homes sprayed with bullets, families terrorized. Each attack seemed to trace back to the same supply lines, the same shadowy figures. Rothwell's absence didn't remove him from the equation. If anything, it made him harder to catch. Detectives described him as a ghost. They knew he was out there, orchestrating deals and staying connected through encrypted platforms. But each time they got close, the trail went cold. Meanwhile, the EncroChat messages piled up. Thousands of lines of conversation, some almost casual in tone, others chilling in their bluntness. Kilos of cocaine discussed like crates of fruit. Guns described in code words, but obvious to those who understood. Rothwell's fingerprints were all over it. By late 2020, British authorities had gathered enough evidence to charge him in his absence. Conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, firearms offenses, serious organized crime allegations. Warrants were issued. His name circulated through Interpol. He was no longer just a Salford gangster. He was an international fugitive. But staying on the run takes more than paranoia. It takes money, safe houses, contacts who don't ask questions. Rothwell had all three, but each move narrowed his options. He couldn't stay in Britain, he couldn't return to Salford, and the longer he stayed abroad, the more his network began to fracture under police pressure. The game that Rothwell had played for years, moving weight, keeping his distance, staying invisible, was suddenly turned against him. The man who once controlled the flow of drugs into Manchester was now the one being hunted. And the hunt was only just beginning. Life on the run is rarely glamorous. For Jamie Rothwell, it wasn't cocktails on the beach or mansions in Marbella. It was survival, cheap rentals, constant phone swaps, looking over his shoulder at every knock on the door. When he fled Britain in 2020, Rothwell thought Spain would give him cover. Thousands of British fugitives had done the same. Sun-soaked resorts, international airports, and communities where no one asked questions. To outsiders, he was just another face in a crowd of expats. But behind that disguise, he was living like a man who knew the walls were closing in. The National Crime Agency and Greater Manchester Police were patient. They knew Rothwell's habits. He was too experienced to flaunt cash, too paranoid to stay in one place. Instead, they worked quietly with Spanish authorities, building the picture piece by piece. It wasn't just sightings that gave him away, it was the digital trail. EncroChat had already exposed his operations. Now investigators watched for patterns, burner phones activated, apartments rented under false names, small details that, on their own, meant nothing. But put together, they drew the outline of a man hiding in plain sight. For Rothwell, paranoia became routine. He changed addresses, avoided public places. Even his associates knew little about where he was staying. But police work thrives on patience. Each move he made only left another breadcrumb for detectives to follow. The break came in Barcelona. Intelligence placed Rothwell inside a modest apartment block, far removed from the luxury villas people imagine when they think of fugitives. Rothwell was arrested by Spanish authorities in Barcelona in May 2025. GMP later confirmed he was swiftly deported back to the UK to face trial. Just like his rivals back home, he knew when the game was up. Years of running ended in a few seconds of silence in a Spanish flat. For investigators, it was a huge victory. Rothwell had been one of Greater Manchester's most wanted, a fugitive linked to the supply of drugs and firearms that had fueled some of the city's bloodiest years. His arrest was more than the capture of one man. It was a signal to Salford's gangs that even abroad there was no escape. But arrest was only the first step. What mattered now was extradition. Rothwell would have to be flown back to Britain to face the charges he had tried to outrun. And back in Manchester, prosecutors were already preparing to put the pieces together. The EncroChat evidence, the drug shipments, the firearms deals. Jamie Rothwell's days as a ghost were over. Now he was about to face the weight of the law. When Jamie Rothwell was taken from that Barcelona apartment, the news traveled fast. For years, his name had hung over Salford like a shadow. Now he was in custody. And for the first time in a long time, it looked like the balance of power was shifting. Spanish police held him briefly, but the real work was already underway in the UK. Greater Manchester Police, working with the National Crime Agency, filed for his extradition. The paperwork was clear. Rothwell was wanted for conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and firearms offenses. He wasn't a small player. He was at the heart of the very operations that had armed and fueled Manchester's gang wars. Extradition cases can drag on for years. But this time it moved quickly. The evidence from EncroChat, combined with years of intelligence, made the case overwhelming. Rothwell was put on a plane back to Britain, escorted under guard, flown not as a tourist but as a prisoner. When he landed, the streets he once roamed weren't waiting to welcome him. Instead, he was driven straight into the custody of Greater Manchester Police. For detectives who had tracked him for years, it was the end of a hunt. For Rothwell, it was the end of the illusion that he could outrun justice. At Manchester Crown Court, the reality of his empire was laid out. Cocaine worth millions. Firearms moved between gangs like tools of the trade. Rothwell wasn't caught with the packages in his hands, but the messages, the contacts, and the logistics showed he didn't need to be. He was orchestrating it. He was supplying the very weapons that tore through Salford's streets. Faced with the evidence, Rothwell pleaded guilty. The quiet admission marked the collapse of years spent trying to stay ahead. His name had once been linked to resilience, to survival in the face of rivals and police alike, but now it was tied to a conviction that left no doubt about his role. The court heard how his operations weren't reckless or chaotic, they were calculated, a business model disguised as gangland chaos. The cocaine pipeline, the firearms supply, all feeding into the wars that left homes destroyed, families scarred, and Salford's reputation darkened. Jamie Rothwell had run to Spain to escape it, but in the end, it all followed him back. When he finally stood before Manchester Crown Court, the years of violence, paranoia, and running were distilled into a handful of charges. Conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, firearms offenses. The language was clinical, but the reality behind it was devastating. Cocaine pipelines, gun deals, and a feud that left Salford scarred. Rothwell didn't fight the case. He pleaded guilty. For prosecutors, it was a confirmation of what they had long argued. Rothwell wasn't just another gangster, he was a crucial cog in the machine that kept the A-Team alive after the murder of Paul Massey. His drugs fueled the profits. His firearms fed the war. The sentence marked the end of a chapter. A man once seen as untouchable, who had survived firebombs, rival hit attempts, and years as a fugitive, was reduced to a prisoner number. For Salford, it didn't mean the violence was over, but it showed that even the most elusive figures could be brought back. Jamie Rothwell's rise and fall is the story of modern, organized crime in Britain, encrypted phones, cross-border manhunts, and a war that left ordinary families living in fear. In the end, Rothwell couldn't escape the one enemy that never misses: time.